So welcome back. You're watching Pro Tools Authority, Episode 9, Segment 3. And let's just pick up where we left off and continue our discussion of markers and selections. So markers are great for storing and recalling specific locations on your timeline, whereas selections allow you to store and recall edit selections, which are edit locations. So first, let's talk about markers. So markers store a spot or selection on your timeline, but they also store variables like your current zoom setting, whether or not your tracks are shown or hidden, current track height settings, and a lot more. So you can store things like location along the timeline with a marker memory location, and then you can recall these settings when you later recall your marker memory location. So let's talk about creating a marker. You can add a marker to your session at any time, even while you're tracking. And if playback is stopped, you can easily be very precise about the marker's location. If you're tracking or listening back to audio, you can also drop a marker mid-playback or recording. So before you add a marker, you'll want to make sure your markers are being displayed. So you can do this by going to View and then Rulers, and then choosing Markers to display your marker ruler. So View and then Rulers, and then you find Markers. So right now it's checked off, so I'm all good. My markers ruler is being displayed. So another way to do that is you can choose Markers from the Ruler Display drop-down menu that we covered in an earlier episode. So then you're simply going to place your edit cursor in the desired location, so where you want the marker to exist along the timeline. So I'm going to do that really quickly here. I'm just going to switch into my Smart Tool, and I'm going to click right here. And so now I've dropped my edit cursor in a location. And then all you have to do is click on the Add Marker Memory Location button at the head of your marker's ruler to open the new memory location dialog box. And this button is the little plus sign that's to the right of where it says Markers at the head of the marker's ruler. So I'm just going to find that marker's ruler. And I'm just going to hit this little button here. So I'll actually try to zoom in for you guys really quickly. Let's see. So it's this little plus sign here. So I'm going to click on that plus sign, and it opens up this new memory location dialog. So another way to open up this dialog box is to hit the Enter key on your numeric keypad, which is a more commonly used method. I usually use that method, but right now I don't have the numeric keypad. So anyway. Once you've opened the new memory location dialog box, you can name the marker in the name field at the top of the dialog. So I'll just type in a name here. It says location 3. I can add to that. I can take things away from it. Yeah, so you name that marker. A lot of times I don't even bother naming the marker. I just move on. But if you want, you can also change the marker number in the number field, although I usually don't do that either. But I can just show you that really quickly. So I can make that a 4 instead of a 3. Okay, so you can also then make sure that you have a marker selected from the time properties section of your dialog box. And there's also the time properties section, but we will talk about the other options in this time properties section later. So you can then select from the reference pop-up menu, and your options are absolute or bar and beat. So that's right here. So right now I'm in bar and beat, but I can shift it to absolute if I want. And basically, if I select absolute, or if you select absolute, then your marker will be placed relative to a specific sample location along your timeline. If you remember from an earlier episode, we discussed samples versus ticks, and this means that your marker will not move if you make a session tempo or meter change. So it's a very similar concept to that samples versus ticks discussion. So, however, if you pick bar and beat for your reference value, then your marker will be placed at a tick-based location along your timeline. So this means that your marker will keep its position relative to your bars and beats in the session. And it also means that if you change your session tempo or meter, then this marker will change its absolute location based on the changes you've made in the meter or tempo. Now, you don't have to change anything under general properties, but it's within this section that you can choose any other options that you want to be associated with your marker. So let's just look at that. It's this section right here, general properties. But if you just want a basic marker here, then you can just leave all of these options unchecked. And that's how I usually make my markers. It's a very common way that engineers will make their markers. So once you're all done with this window, just click OK and your marker will be created. And you'll see this little yellow flag that denotes the marker location that will appear in the marker's ruler. And the location of this flag will correspond with the location of your memory location. So let's just do that. So I'm going to hit OK. And you remember where I put my edit cursor earlier? It's right here. So here's my little yellow flag that denotes that I have a marker there. And it says location 3, and it has all those letters that I put there because that's a really important marker name that I just made. So as I mentioned, you can add markers during playback or recording. So let's talk about how to do that. You can add a marker during playback or recording in a similar fashion to how we just added a marker. And when you created a marker during playback, the marker will be dropped in the location where the playback cursor was when you first opened the new memory location dialog window. So just like when playback is stopped, you can create a marker during playback or recording by making sure your marker's ruler is displayed, either using the ruler view drop-down menu or by going to view and then rulers and then markers. And then you just start playback or recording, and you can create a marker at any point by clicking the add marker or memory location button that's at the head of the marker's ruler that we showed before. It's that little plus sign button, right? Or by hitting the enter key on your numeric keypad. So let's just do that really quickly. I'm going to go over here so we don't have any audio playing over what I'm saying. But basically we have, I just started playback. And so now I could either hit the enter key on that numeric keypad, or I could go to markers over here and hit that plus sign, and that'll pop up that new memory location dialog. And then I can just hit OK or hit enter again, and it'll drop that marker right here where my playback cursor was when I first opened that dialog. So I'm just going to stop playback. So, whenever you just select whatever options you want, it's the same way as how we just made a memory a marker, and then you just hit OK. So it's other than the fact that playback is happening and that it's going with the playback cursor location, it's a very similar concept to what we just did. So when I'm making markers during playback or recording, I always use the enter key on the numeric keypad, and that's how most engineers seem to do it. So now that you know how to make a memory location, let's talk about the memory locations window. So to open the memory locations window, you simply go to the window menu in Pro Tools and select memory locations. So I'm just going to open that up really quickly. So window, I'm going to find memory locations right here. I'm just going to click on that to open it. So here's my memory locations window. The memory locations window will pop up, and within that memory locations window, you can view all of the markers and other types of memory locations within your session. So you can easily click on the entry for a specific memory location within the memory locations window in order to recall that marker's location. So I'm just going to do that really quickly. So I'm going to click on an entry here. Let's see, what's the farthest to there's location 3 is over here. Oh, but I have that highlighted. All right, let's click on. Yeah, so you can see the cursor moving about as I click on the different memory locations. Okay. Or you can also recall a marker location by typing period and then the number of the marker location and then typing period again, all on the numeric keypad. So that's a similar way to just drag or it's not really dragging, but move your edit cursor to the memory location. So another thing you can do is you can click on the marker symbol for that marker ruler to recall the marker and move the playback cursor to that location. Anyway, You can also delete a marker location in Pro Tools. So one way to do this is to open your memory locations window by going to that window menu and then selecting memory locations, and then click on whichever entry you want to delete, and then click on the memory locations menu button and pick the clear option. It will say clear, and then you're going to pick the marker's name. So let's see. So I'm going to click on this. I'm going to have clear. So it says clear, and then it says the marker name. And so right now I'm on location 3. So you'll notice if I click on this, it clears that marker. So another way you can delete the marker is by finding the yellow flag for it in the marker's ruler and clicking on dragging it off of the ruler. So this is I've seen this as a more common way to delete a marker. Most people don't hang out with their memory locations window open. It's just less common. There's nothing wrong with it. But anyway, you find the little yellow flag for the marker. So I'm going to delete location 2. I'm just going to click and drag and see how there's a little trash can icon now. And then when I release, the marker is gone. So another way to delete a marker is by holding Option or Alt if you're in a Windows machine, and then clicking on any marker in the marker ruler. So this is very similar and very common way to do this. But you find the marker. So right here, I'm gonna target this location 1. I'm gonna hold Option, and you'll see how it adds this little minus sign. So I'm actually gonna zoom in so you guys can see this a little better. So I'm gonna hold Option, and you see my mouse turns into this mouse with the negative icon, and then I just click, and then the marker's gone. Okay. So you can also create a selection using markers. So you can select between 2 markers, which can be really useful for selecting different sections that you've labeled with markers. For example, if you dropped a marker at the beginning of your choruses and your verses, you can now easily select something like a chorus using those markers. So to make a selection between any 2 marker locations, just click on the first marker that you want to use for the selection, which will recall the location for that marker, if you remember from just a few minutes ago. So I'm going to actually have to make a few markers here really quickly. So I'm going to find this button on the markers ruler and just make a marker and make another marker. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this first marker over here to recall that location. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the Shift key, and then I'm going to click on the second marker for the selection. And then the selection should be highlighted. So I clicked on that one. I'm going to hold Shift. Again, Shift is good for highlighting things in Pro Tools. And I click on that second marker location, and now it's made the highlight for me. Okay. So let's move on from markers and start talking about some editing techniques. So once you have your MIDI or audio within your Pro Tools session, it's extremely likely that you'll want to do some editing work on that MIDI or audio data. So editing is great for artificially improving your performance, adjusting sounds, and otherwise smoothing and polishing your audio to create a final product. So let's talk about some details of editing so that you can improve your editing workflow and your process. So first, let's talk about your playback options. There are a few different playback options that you can opt to use while editing in Pro Tools. A couple of the most commonly used ones include loop playback, and your scrolling options. Now, we mentioned some of the scrolling options before, but let's go into them in more detail. So your options include the no scrolling option, the after playback option, and the page scrolling option. These options control how any contents of your edit window will be shown or displayed while you're playing back or recording in Pro Tools. So you can find these options and select which one you'd like to use by going to the Options menu, selecting Edit Window Scrolling, and then selecting the option you'd like. So I'll just show you that. Options, and then we're going to find Edit Window Scrolling. And so here are these options that we're talking about. So the no scrolling option will keep your screen from following along with the current location of your playback cursor during playback and during recording. So it's useful for if you're trying to edit something and you want to make sure that your screen stays centered on what you're editing, even if you're allowing playback to continue past or start before what you can see on the screen. Alternatively, the after playback option will scroll to wherever your playback ends and will then center the screen around the end point of your playback or record. And this option is very useful for if you're searching for a specific point to edit. You can simply hit play on your session and listen for the point that you want to edit, or listen for anything that needs to be edited. And once you hear it, just stop playback and your screen will scroll to that end point. Now, the page scrolling option will scroll the screen during playback. So you'll see it scroll one page at a time as your playback, you play back your session. And again, you can choose between no scrolling, after playback, and page scrolling by going to that options menu and then edit window scrolling and then choosing your option. Now, there's also the loop playback function in Pro Tools. This function is great for editing because it allows you to listen to a selection on repeat. So this continuous repeat function can be very useful. So if you want to use loop playback, first make your selection in the edit window using your edit cursor. So let's actually do this one really quickly here. So I'm going to get a small section just so we can see what happens. And let's see, how many seconds is this? We'll make it a very short section so we can see what happens here. And I'm going to solo this just so, because I'm not sure what I have exactly in my session right now. But what we're going to do is we're going to go to that options menu we were in, and then we're going to choose loop playback. So I'm going to go to options and find loop playback, and that is enabled right now. So it's checked off. So we're in that option. And then when you select this, you'll notice that your playback button in your transport window, which is also located in the transport section of the toolbar in your edit window, becomes a playback button with a loop arrow, like a loop arrow icon around the play icon. So you see this arrow here. It's around that play icon. So when we're not, I'll just show you that. When we're not in loop playback, it's just a normal play button. But then when we go back to options and we go back into loop playback, it brings back that arrow, right? Okay. So then all you have to do is simply click play or hit the space bar on your keyboard to begin the continuously looped playback. So this might not sound that great because I didn't pick a specific beat point or anything, but it will just repeat. So now you can adjust the bounds of your selection in order to adjust what's playing back. So for example, you can drag the in and out points around the timeline ruler to change the length and location of your loop, and your loop will immediately adjust to your changes. And you can do that during playback as well. So one thing to note is that in order for loop playback to work, your selection must be at least 0.5 seconds long. So if you make the selection too short, it's not going to work. It's going to give you a little error message. But I guess that's all that we have for today. But I hope there was some good information in there, and you can use next time you use Pro Tools. And next time, what we're going to do is we're going to continue to discuss various editing techniques, including more details on using your editing modes, like how to use the various grid modes, as well as tips for using shuffle, slip, and spot modes. And we will also cover more tips for editing with clips, including tips for cutting, copying, pasting, duplicating, and clearing clips. And we'll also cover the repeat command and how to separate and heal clips. So I hope to see you guys here again soon, and thank you for watching Pro Tools Authority, and I'll see you guys next week.